Chapter 7. Abbasid Decline and the Spread of Islamic Civilization to South and Southeast Asia. Of all the factors that contributed to the spread of Islamic civilization in the millennium after the Prophet Muhammad received his divine revelations in the early 7th century CE, perhaps none was as crucial yet neglected as the rather modest sailing vessels that piled the waters of the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Most commonly known as dhows, see Chapter 6, page 253, but appearing in numerous variations with different names and found from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean, these ships were probably first developed along the Nile River. Compared to the great junks of China, or even many of the less imposing trading ships in the Indian Ocean in the Classical Age, dhows were rather small vessels. They normally had one or two masts and planked. Wooden hulls that resembled modern yachts in shape, with pointed bows and square sterns, figure 7.1. The dhow's hull's design contributed to their swiftness and maneuverability, but it was the configuration of their sails that have made them one of the most popular and enduring of the world's ships for 2 millennia. Dhows were propelled by one or two large triangular lateen sails that attached to the mast by long brooms or yard arms, which extended diagonally high across both the fore and aft portions of the ship. Although their relatively shallow hulls meant that dhows could not match junks or bulkier merchant ships in cargo capacity, their slender shape gave them a considerable advantage over most other ships in speed, and their triangular sails meant that they could track against the wind, which square-rigged ships could not. Most often, however, those who sailed them followed a seasonal pattern set by the direction of the monsoon winds that alternated between flows to the sea or land according to the time of year in the Indian Ocean and adjacent waterways. Though galleys, like those of classical Greece and Rome, were widely used by Arabs in the Mediterranean, from Spain to China, tens of thousands of dhows were the main carriers of Muslim commerce, and along with merchants and their trade goods, many of the same ships conveyed Sufis or Muslim holy men to regions as far-flung as India, Java and Malaya, and the Philippine Islands. Seaworthy ships like the dhows were essential to the remarkable spread of the Islamic faith and the civilization it gave rise to in this era. In contrast to the expansion of Muslim empires, which was largely carried out by Arab armies traveling over land, lasting mass conversions of conquered peoples in the religion of Islam were mainly due to the efforts of Sufis and other spiritual leaders who traveled by caravan into Central Asia and across the Sahara, or traversed the seas in sturdy dhows. In either case, those who went out to win converts to Islam also disseminated broader products of Muslim culture. These included the Arabic language, advanced technologies such as water pumps and windmills, Muslim science, law and philosophy, and Islamic art and architecture. Despite their speed and dexterity, dhows did not make great warships, either before or after gunpowder was introduced into sea warfare. They were too small to provide a suitable firing platform for regular cannon, and they could not carry enough soldiers to grapple aboard and overwhelm the crews of enemy ships. Like most of the ships that sailed the seas of the Middle East, East Africa, and Asia, dhows were built for trade and not war. Designs for that purpose served the people of the Indian Ocean and adjoining seas well into the last years of the 15th century. But with the arrival of well-armed Portuguese fleets after 498, neither the dhows nor any of the ships in Asia west of the South China Sea could hold back expansionist Christian warriors and seafarers eager to tap into the wealth, knowledge, and technological acumen of Islamic and Chinese culture zones far more advanced in most areas of human endeavor than their own. Even as Muslim traders and Sufi holy men spread Islam across a great swath of Afro-Eurasia from North Africa in the west to the Philippines in the east, the Abbasid Empire was crumbling from within. In many of the areas newly won to the faith, rival dynasties arose to challenge Abbasid power. These new polities, spelled Polities, and the Abbasids themselves were in turn threatened by the invasion of nomadic peoples launched by successive waves of Turkish speakers and the Mongols from Central Asia, as well as Berber jihadists from Saharan Africa. Ironically, as the political hold of various Muslim rulers weakened, Islamic civilization reached new heights of creativity. As we shall see in the chapter that follows, the Abbasid age was a time of remarkable achievements in architecture and the fine arts, in literature and philosophy, and mathematics and the sciences. Many of these developments were enriched by the wealth, knowledge, and products exchanged among many regions of an ever-expanding Muslim world, and the non-Muslim peoples contacted in border regions from Europe to China. From the 10th to the 14th centuries, Muslim mystics, traders, and at times warriors carried the faith of Muhammad across much of the known world. In this chapter, we will focus on this process in South and Southeast Asia. In those that follow, North and West Africa and Central Asia will be the focus of our inquiry. The Islamic heartlands in the Middle and Late Abbasid eras. As early as the reign of the third Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi, 775 to 785, the courtly excess and political divisions that eventually contributed to the decline of the empire were apparent. Al-Mahdi's efforts to reconcile the moderates among the Shia opposition to Abbasid rule ended in failure. This meant that Shia revolts and assassination attempts against Abbasid officials would plague the dynasty to the end of its days. Al-Mahdi also abandoned the frugal ways of his predecessor. In the brief span of his reign, he established a taste for luxury and monumental building and surrounding himself with a multitude of dependent wives, concubines, and courtiers. These habits would prove to be an ever greater financial drain in the reigns of later caliphs. Perhaps most critically, al-Mahdi failed to solve the vexing problem of succession. Not only did he waver between which of his older sons would succeed him, but he allowed his wives and concubines, the mothers of different candidates, to become involved in the palace intrigues that became a standard feature of the transfer of power from one caliph to the next. Although a full-scale civil war was avoided after al-Mahdi's death, within a year his eldest son and successor was poisoned. That act cleared the way for one of the most famous and enduring of the Abbasid caliphs, Harun al-Rashid, 786 to 809, to ascend the throne. Imperial extravagance and succession disputes. Emissaries sent to the emissaries is spelled Emissaries, sent to the early 9th century to Baghdad from Carlemagne. It's spelled Charlemagne. Carlemagne. I'm going to say it that way. From Carlemagne, then the most powerful monarch in Christian Europe, provide ample evidence that Harun al-Rashid shared his father's taste for sumptuous living. Harun al-Rashid dazzled the Christians with the splendor of Baghdad's mosques, palaces, and treasure troves, which is reflected in the painting of nightlife in a palace in Figure 7.2. He also sent them back to Carlemagne, which presents, including an intricate water clock and an elephant, which are literally worth a king's ransom. The luxury and intrigue of Harun's court have also been immortalized by the tales of the 1001 Nights. See the document in Chapter 6. Set in the Baghdad of his day. The plots and maneuvers of the courtesans, eunuchs, spelled eunuchs, and royal ministers related in the tales suggest yet another source of dynastic weakness. Partly because he was only 23 at the time of his ascension to the throne, Harun became heavily dependent, particularly in the years of his reign, on a family of Persian advisors. Although he eventually resisted their influence, the growth of the power of royal advisors at the expense of the caliphs became a clear trend in succeeding reigns. In fact, the mid-9th century onward, most caliphs were pawns in the power struggles between different factions at the court. Harun al-Rashid's death promoted the first of several full-scale civil wars over succession. In itself, the precedent set by the struggle for the throne was deeply damaging, but it had an additional consequence that would all but end the real power of the caliphs. The first civil war convinced the sons of al-Mamun, 813 to 833, the winner, to build personal armies in anticipation of the fight for the throne that would break out when their father died. One of the sons, the victor in the next round of succession struggles, recruited a bodyguard of some 4,000 slaves, mostly Turkic-speaking nomads from Central Asia. On becoming caliph, he increased his mercenary force to more than 70,000. Not surprisingly, this impressive army soon became a power center in its own right. In 846, slave mercenaries murdered the reigning caliph and placed one of his sons on the throne. In the next decade, 4 more caliphs were assassinated or poisoned by the mercenary forces. From this time onward, the leaders of the slave mercenary armies were often the real power behind the Abbasid throne and were major players in the struggle for control of the capital and empire. The mercenaries also became a major force for violent social unrest. They were often the catalyst for food riots that broke out periodically when the price of everyday staples rose too sharply because of shortages or price gouging in Baghdad and other urban centers. Imperial breakdown and agrarian disorder. In the last decades of the 9th century, the dynasty brought the slave armies under control for a time, but at a great cost. Constant civil violence drained the treasury and alienated the subjects of the Abbasids. A future strain was placed on the empire's dwindling revenues by some caliphs' attempts to escape the turmoil of Baghdad by establishing new capitals near the original one. The construction of palaces, mosques, and public works for each of these new imperial centers added to the already exorbitant costs of maintaining the court and imperial administration. Of course, the expense fell heavily on the already hard-pressed peasantry of the central provinces of the empire, where some imperial control remained. The need to support growing numbers of mercenary troops also increased the revenue demands on the peasantry. Spiraling taxation and outright pillaging led to the destruction or abandonment of many villages in the richest provinces of the empire. The great irrigation works that had for centuries been essential to agricultural production in the fertile Tigris-Euphrates basin fell into despair, and in some areas they collapsed entirely. Some peasants perished through flood, famine, or violent assault. Others fled to the wilderness areas beyond the reach of the Abbasid tax collectors or to neighboring kingdoms. Some formed bandit gangs or joined the crowds of vagabonds that trudged the highways and camped in the towns of the imperial heartland. In many cases, dissident religious groups, such as the various Shia sects, instigated peasant uprisings. Shia participation meant that these movements sought not only to correct the official abuses that had occurred under the Abbasid regime, but to destroy the dynasty itself. The declining position of women in the family and society. The harem and the veil became the twin emblems of women's increasing subjugation to men and confinement to the home in the Abbasid era. Although the seclusion of women had been practiced by some Middle Eastern peoples since ancient times, the harem was a creation of the Abbasid court. The wives and the concubines of Abbasid caliphs were restricted to forbidden quarters of the imperial palace. Many of the concubines were slaves, who could win their freedom and gain power by bearing healthy sons for the rulers. The growing wealth of the Abbasid elite created a great demand for female and male slaves, who were found by tens of thousands in Baghdad and other large cities. Most of these urban slaves continued to perform domestic services in the homes of the wealthy. One of the 10th century caliphs is said to have had 11,000 eunuchs among his slave corps. Another is said to have kept 4,000 slave concubines. Most of the slaves had been captured or purchased in the non-Muslim regions surrounding the empire, including the Balkans, Central Asia, and Sudanic Africa. They were sold in the slave markets found in all the larger towns of the Abbasid realm. Female and male slaves were prized for their beauty and their intelligence. Some of the best educated men and women in the empire were slaves. Consequently, caliphs and high officials often spent more time with their clever and talented slave concubines than with their less educated wives. Slave concubines and servants often had more personal liberty than freeborn wives. Slave women could go to the market, and they did not have to wear the veils and robes that were required for free women in public places. Although women from the lower class farmed, wove clothing and rugs, or raised silkworms to help support their families, rich women were allowed almost no career outlets beyond the home. Often married at puberty, legally set at age 9, women were raised to devote their lives to running a household and serving their husbands. But at the highest levels of society, wives and concubines cajoled, spelled C-A-J-O-L-E-D, their husbands, and plotted with eunuchs. It's spelled E-U-N-U-C-H-S. I know I've spelled that before. I can't figure out how to pronounce it. And plotted with eunuchs and royal advisors to advance the interests of their sons and win them for the ruler's backing for succession to the throne. Despite these brief incursions into power politics, by the end of the Abbasid era, the freedom and influence, both within the family and in the wider world, the women had enjoyed in the first century of Islamic expansion had been severely curtailed. Nomadic incursions and eclipse of caliph power. Preoccupied by struggles in the capital and central provinces, the caliphs and their advisors were powerless to prevent further losses of territory in the outer reaches of the empire. And in addition, areas as close to the capital as Egypt and Syria broke away from Abbasid rule, map 7.1. More alarmingly, by the mid-10th century, independent kingdoms that had formed in areas where once provinces of the empire were moving to supplant the Abbasids as lords of the Islamic world. In 945, the armies of one of these regional splinter dynasties, the Buyads of Persia, invaded the heartlands of the Abbasid Empire and captured Baghdad. From this point onward, the caliphs were little more than puppets controlled by families such as the Buyads. Buyad leaders took the title of Sultan, victorious in Arabic, which came to designate Muslim rulers, especially in the West. The Buyads controlled the caliph and the court, but they could not prevent the future disintegration of the empire. In just over a century, the Buyids' control over the Caliph was broken, and they were supplanted in 1055 by another group of nomadic invaders from Central Asia via Persia, the Seljuk Turks. For the next 2 centuries, Turkic military leaders ruled the remaining portions of the Abbasid Empire in the name of caliphs, who were usually of Arab or Persian extraction. The Seljuks were staunch Sunnis, and they moved quickly to purge the Shia officials who had risen to power under the Buyids and to rid the Caliph domains of the Shia influences the Buyids had tried to promote. For a time, the Seljuk military machine was also able to restore political initiative to much reduced caliphate. Seljuk victories ended the threat of conquest by a rival Shia dynasty centered in Egypt. They also humbled the Byzantines, who had hoped to take advantage of Muslim divisions to regain some of their long-lost lands. The Byzantines' crushing defeat also opened the way to the settlement of Asia Minor, or Anatolia, by nomadic peoples of Turkic origins, some of whom would soon begin to lay the foundations of the Ottoman Empire. The impact of the Christian Crusades. Soon after seizing power, the Seljuks faced a very different challenge to Islamic civilization. It came from Christian Crusades, knights from Western Europe, see Chapter 10, who were determined to capture the portions of the Islamic world that made up the Holy Land of biblical times. Muslim political divisions and the element of surprise made the first of the Crusade assaults between 1096 and 1099 by far the most successful. Much of the Holy Land was captured and divided into Christian kingdoms. In June 1099, the main objective of the Crusade, Jerusalem, was taken, and the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were massacred by the rampaging Christian knights. For nearly 2 centuries, the Europeans, who eventually mounted 8 crusades that varied widely in strength and success, maintained a precarious hold on the eastern Mediterranean region. But they posed little threat to the more powerful Muslim princes, whose disregard for the Christians was demonstrated by the fact that they continued to quarrel among themselves despite the intruders' aggression. We united under a strong leader, as they were under Saladin, known as Saladin in Christian Europe, in the last decades of the 12th century. The Muslims rapidly reconquered most of the Crusader outposts. Saladin's death in 1193 and the subsequent breakup of his kingdom gave the remaining Christian citadels some respite. But the last of the Crusader kingdoms was lost with the fall of Acre in 1291. Undoubtedly, the impact of the Crusades was much greater on the Christians who launched them than on the Muslim peoples who had to fend them off, because there had long been so much contact between Western Europe and the Islamic world through trade and through the Muslim kingdoms in Spain and southern Italy. It is difficult to be sure which influences to attribute specifically to the Crusades, but the Crusaders' first-hand experiences in the eastern Mediterranean certainly intensified European borrowing from the Muslim world that had been going on for centuries. Muslim weapons such as the famous Damascene swords, named after the city of Damascus, were highly prized and sometimes copied by the Europeans, who were always eager to improve on their methods of making war. Muslim techniques of building fortifications were adopted by many Christian rulers, as can be seen in the castle built in Normandy in coastal England by William the Conqueror and his successors in the 11th and 12th centuries. Richard the Lionhearted's legendary preference for Muslim over Christian physicians was but one sign of the emperor's avid avid centuries-old interest in the superior scientific learning of Muslim peoples. For Muslims and Jews in Spain, Sicily, Egypt, and the Middle East, the Europeans recovered much of the Greek learning that had been lost to northern Europe during the waves of nomadic invasions after the fall of Rome. They also mastered Arabic, properly Indian, numerals and decimal system, and they benefited from the great advances Arab and Persian thinkers had made in mathematics and many of the sciences. The European demand for Middle Eastern rugs and textiles is demonstrated by the Oriental rugs and tapestries that adorn the homes of European upper classes in Renaissance and early modern paintings. It is also reflected in European and your own names for different kinds of cloth, such as fustian, taffeta, muslin, and damask, which are derived from Persian terms or the names of Muslim cities where the cloth was produced and sold. Muslim influences affected both the elite and proper cultures of much of Western Europe in this period. These included Persian and Arabic words such as chess, chivalric ideals, and troubadour ballads, as well as foods such as dates, coffee, and yogurt. Some of these imports, namely the songs of the troubadours, can be traced directly to the contacts the Crusaders made in the Holy Land. But most were part of a process of exchange that extended over centuries and was largely a one-way process. Though Arab traders imported some manufactures, such as glass and cloth, and raw materials from Europe, Muslim peoples in this era showed little interest in learning or institutions of the West. Nevertheless, the Italian merchant communities, which remained after the political and military power of the Crusaders had been extinguished in the Middle East, contributed a good deal more than these ongoing interchanges than all the forays of Christian knights. An age of learning and artistic refinements. Although town life became more dangerous, the rapid growth and increasing prosperity that characterized the first centuries of Muslim expansion continued until late in the Abbasid era. Despite the declining revenue based on the caliphate and deteriorating conditions in the countryside, there was a great expansion of the professional classes, particularly doctors, scholars, and legal and religious experts, figure 7.3. Muslim, Jewish, and in some areas Christian entrepreneurs amassed great fortunes, supplying the cities of the empire with staples such as grain and barley, essentials like cotton and woolen textiles for clothing, and luxury items such as precious gems, citrus fruits, and sugarcane. Long-distance trade between the Middle East and Mediterranean Europe, between coastal India and Southeast Asia, in addition to the overland caravan trade with China, flourished through much of the Abbasid era, map 7.2. Among the chief beneficiaries of sustained urban prosperity were artists and artisans, who continued the formidable achievements in architecture and the crafts that had begun in Umayyad period. Mosques and palaces grew larger and more ornate in most parts of the empire. Even in outlying areas such as Cordoban, Spain, Muslim engineers and architects created some of the great architectural treasures of all time. The tapestries and rugs of Muslim peoples, such as the Persians, were in great demand from Europe to China. To this day, Muslim rugs have rarely been matched for their exquisite design, their vivid colors, and the skill with which they are woven. Muslim artisans also produce fine bronzes and superb ceramics. The full flowering of Persian literature. As Persian wives, concubines, advisors, bureaucrats, and after the mid-10th century, Persian caliphs came to play central roles in imperial politics. Persian gradually replaced Arabic as the primary written language at the Abbasid court. Arabic remained the language of religion, law, and the natural sciences. Persian was favored by Arabs, Turks, and Muslims of Persian descent as the language of literary expression. administration, and scholarship. In Baghdad and major cities throughout the Abbasid Empire and in neighboring kingdoms, Persian was the chief language of the high culture, the language of polite exchanges between courtiers as well as of history, poetic musings, and mystical revelations. Written in a modified Arabic script and a drawing selectively on Arabic vocabulary, the Persian of the Abbasid age was a supple language as beautiful to look at when drafted by a skilled calligrapher as was to read out loud figure 7.4. Catchphrases, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou, from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, are certainly pieces of Persian literature best known in the West, but other writings from this period surpass Khayyam in profundity of thought and elegance of style. Perhaps the single most important work was the lengthy epic poem Shahnameh, Book of Kings, written by Firdausi in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The work relates the history of Persia from the beginnings of time to the Islamic conquest, and it abounds in dramatic details of battles, intrigues, and illicit love affairs. Firdausi's Persian had been extolled from its grand musical virtuosity, and portions of the Shahnameh and other Persian works were read aloud to musical accompaniment. Brilliantly illustrated manuscripts of Firdausi's epic history are among the most exquisite works of Islamic art. In addition to historical epics, Persian writers in the Abbasid era wrote on many subjects, from doomed love affairs and statecraft to incidents from everyday life and mystical striving for communion with the divine. One of the great poets of the age, Sa'di, fuses an everyday message with a religious one in the following relation of a single moment in his own life. Often I am minded, from the days of my childhood, how once I went out with my father on a festival. In fun I grew preoccupied with all the folk about, losing touch with my father in the popular confusion. In terror and bewilderment I raised up a cry. Then suddenly my father boxed my ears. You bold-eyed child, how many times now? How have I told you not to lose hold of my skirt? A tiny child cannot walk alone, for it is difficult to take away not to see. You too, poor friend, are but a child upon endeavor's way. Go, seize the skirts of those who know the way. This blend of the mystical and commonplace was widely adopted in literature of this period. It epitomized the Rubaiyat, whose author is much more concerned with finding meaning in life and a path to union with the divine than with extolling the delights of picnics in the garden with beautiful women. This blend of the mystical and commonplace were widely adopted in the literature of this period. It is epitomized in the Rubaiyat, whose author is much more concerned with finding meaning in life and a path to union with the divine than with extolling the delights of picnics in the garden with beautiful women. Oh, I already read that. Okay, achievements in the sciences. From preserving and compiling the learning of the ancient civilizations they had conquered in the early centuries of expansion, Muslim peoples and the Jewish scholars who lived peacefully in Muslim lands increasingly became creators and inventors in their own right. For several centuries, which spanned much of the period of Abbasid rule, Islamic civilization outstripped all others in scientific discoveries, new techniques of investigation, and new technologies. The many Muslim accomplishments in these areas include Major corrections to the algebraic and geometric theories of the ancient Greeks, and great advances in the use of basic concepts of trigonometry, the sine, cosine, and tangent. Two discoveries in chemistry that were fundamental to all later investigation were the creation of the objective experiment and Al-Razi's scheme of classifying all material substances into three categories: animal, vegetable, and mineral. The sophistication of the Muslim scientific techniques is indicated by the fact that in the 11th century, Al-Biruni was able to calculate the specific weight of major minerals. This sophistication was also manifested in astronomical instruments, such as those in Figure 7.5, developed through cooperation between Muslim scholars and skilled artisans. Their astronomical tables and maps of the stars were in great demand among scholars of other civilizations, including those of Europe and China. As these breakthroughs suggest, much of the Muslims' work in scientific investigation had very practical applications. This practical bent was even greater in other fields. For example, Muslim cities such as Cairo boasted some of the best hospitals in the world. Doctors and pharmacists had to follow a regular course of study and passed a formal examination before they were allowed to practice. Muslim scientists did important work on optics and bladder ailments. Muslim traders introduced into the Islamic world and Europe were basic machines and techniques, namely paper making, silk weaving, and ceramic firing, that had been devised earlier in China. In addition, Muslim scholars made some of the world's best maps, which were copied by geographers from Portugal to Poland. Religious trends and the new push for expansion. The contradictory trends in Islamic civilization, social strife, and political divisions versus expanded trading links and intellectual creativity were strongly reflected in patterns of religious development in the later centuries of the Caliphate. On one hand, a resurgence of mysticism in centuries of the On one hand, a resurgence of mysticism injected Islam with a new vibrancy. On the other hand, Orthodox religious scholars, such as the ulama, grew increasingly suspicious of and hostile to non-Islamic ideas and scientific thinking. The Crusades had promoted the latter trend. This was particularly true regarding Muslim borrowing from ancient Greek learning, which the ulama associated with the aggressive civilizations of Christian Europe. Many Orthodox scholars suspected that the questioning that characterized Greek tradition would undermine the absolute authority of the Quran. They insisted that the Quran was the final, perfect, and complete revelation of an all-knowing divinity. Brilliant thinkers such as Al-Ghazali, perhaps the greatest Islamic theologian, struggled to fuse the Greek and Quranic traditions. Their ideas were often rejected by Orthodox scholars. Much of the religious vitality in Islam in the later Abbasid period was centered on the Sufist movement and its various guises spelled Guises, including both Sunni and Shia manifestations. Sufism was a reaction against the impersonal and abstract divinity that made many Mullah scholars argue was the true God of the Quran. Like the Indian mystics, the Sufis, whose title was derived from the woolen robes they wore, and their followers tried to see beyond what they believed to the illusory existence of everyday life, and to delight in the presence of Allah in the world. True to the strict monotheism of Islam, most Sufis insisted on clear distinction between Allah and humans. But in some Sufist teachings, Allah permeated the universe in ways that appeared to compromise true transcendent status. Some Sufis gained reputations as great healers and workers of miracles. Others led militant bands that tried to spread Islam to non-believers. Some Sufis used asceticism or bodily denial to find Allah. Others used meditation, songs, drugs, or ecstatic dancing, which gave the famous whirling dervishes their name. Most Sufis built up a sizable following, and the movement as a whole was a central factor in continuing expansion of the Muslim region and Islamic civilization in later centuries of the Abbasid Caliphate. New waves of nomadic invasion and the end of the Caliphate. As we have seen, in the 10th and 11th centuries, the Abbasid domains were divided by ever-growing numbers of rival successor states. In the early 13th century, a new threat arose at the eastern edge of the original Abbasid domains. Another Central Asian nomadic people, the Mongols, united by their great commander, Genghis Khan, first raided in the 1220s and then smashed the Turco-Persian kingdoms that had developed in the regions to the east of Baghdad. Genghis Khan died before the heartlands of the Muslim world were invaded, but his grandson, Hulagu, renewed the Mongol assault on the rich centers of Islamic civilization in the 1250s. In 1258, the Abbasid capital at Baghdad was taken by the Mongols, and much of it was sacked. The 37th and last Abbasid caliph was put to death by the Mongols. They then continued westward until they finally defeated the Mamluks, or Turkic slaves, who then ruled Egypt. Baghdad never recovered from the Mongol attacks. In 1401, it suffered a second capture and another round of pillaging by the even fiercer forces of Timur, or Tamerlane, another Turkic conqueror from Central Asia. Baghdad shrank from the status of one of the great cities of the world to a provincial backwater. It was gradually supplanted by Cairo to the west and then Istanbul to the north. The coming of Islam to South Asia. All through the millennia, when a succession of civilizations from Harappa to Brahmanic empire of Guptas developed in South Asia, foreigners had entered India in waves of nomadic invaders or as small bands of displaced people seeking refuge. Invariably, those who chose to remain were assimilated into civilizations they encountered in the lowland areas. They converted to the Hindu or Buddhist religion, found a place in the caste hierarchy, and adopted the dress, foods, and lifestyle of the farming and city-dwelling peoples of many regions of the subcontinent. This capacity to absorb peoples moving into the area resulted from the strength and flexibility of India's civilizations, and from the fact that India's people usually enjoyed a higher level of material culture than migrant groups entering the subcontinent. As a result, the persistent failure of Indian rulers to unite against aggressors meant periodic disruptions and local destruction, but not fundamental challenges to the existing order. All of this changed with the arrival of the Muslims in the last year of the 7th century CE, map 7.2. With the coming of Muslims, the people of India encountered for the first time a large-scale influx of bearers of a civilization as sophisticated, if not ancient, as their own. They were also confronted by a religious system that was in many ways the very opposite of the ones they had nurtured. Hinduism, the predominant Indian religion at that time, was open, tolerant, and inclusive of widely varying forms of religious devotion, from idol worship to meditation in search of in search of union with spiritual source of all creation. Islam was doctrinaire, proselytizing, and committed to the exclusive worship of a single transcendent God. Socially, Islam was highly egalitarian, proclaiming all believers equal in the sight of God. In sharp contrast, Hindu beliefs validated the caste hierarchy. The latter rested on the acceptance of inborn differences between individuals and the groups and widely varying levels of material wealth, status, and religious purity these differences were believed to produce. Thus, the faith of the invading Muslims were religiously more rigid than that of the absorptive and adaptive Hindus. But the caste-based social system of India was much more compartmentalized and closed than the society of the Muslim invaders, with their emphasis on mobility and the community of believers. Because growing numbers of Muslim warriors, traders, Sufi mystics, and ordinary farmers and herders entered South Asia and settled there, extensive interaction between invaders and the indigenous people was inevitable. In the early centuries of the Muslim influx, conflict, even violence predominated. But there was also a good deal of trade and even religious interchange between them. As time passed, peaceful, if wary, interaction became the norm. Muslim rulers employed large numbers of Hindus to govern the largely non-Muslim populations they conquered. Mosques and temples dominated different quarters within Indian cities, and Hindu and Muslim mystics strove to find areas of agreement between their two faiths. Nonetheless, tensions remained, and periodically they erupted into communal rioting or warfare between Hindu and Muslim lords. Political divisions and the first Muslim invasions. The first and least enduring Muslim intrusion, which came in 711, resulted indirectly from the peaceful trading contacts that had initially brought Muslims into contact with Indian civilization. Since ancient times, Arab seafarers and traders had been major carriers in the vast trading network that had stretched from Italy in the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. After converting to Islam, these traders continued to visit the ports of India, particularly those on the western coast. An attack by pirates sailing from Sindh in western India, map 7.3, on ships owned by some of these Arab traders, promoted the viceroy of the eastern provinces of the Umayyad Empire to launch a punitive expedition against the king of Sindh. An able Arab general, Muhammad ibn, spelled IBN, Qasim, Muhammad ibn Qasim was only 17 years old when the when the campaign began, led more than 10,000 horse and camel-mounted warriors into Sindh to avenge the assault of Arab shipping. After victories in several fiercely fought battles, Muhammad ibn Qasim declared the region, as well as the Indus Valley to the northeast, provinces of the Umayyad Empire. In these early centuries, the coming of Islam brought little change for most inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent. In fact, in many areas, local leaders and populace surrendered towns and districts willingly to the conquerors because they promised lighter taxation and greater religious tolerance. The Arab overlords decided to treat both Hindus and Buddhists as protected people of the book, despite the fact their faiths had no connection to the Bible, the book in question. This meant that although they were obliged to pay special taxes, non-Muslims like Jews and Christians enjoyed the freedom to worship as they pleased. As in other areas conquered by the Arabs, most of the local officials and notables retained their positions, which did much to reconcile them to Muslim rule. The status and privileges of the Brahmin caste were respected. Nearly all Arabs, who made up only a tiny minority of the population, lived in cities or special garrison towns. Because little effort was expended into converting the peoples of the conquered areas, they remained overwhelmingly Hindu or Buddhist. Indian influences on Islamic civilization. Although the impact of Islam on the Indian subcontinent in this period was limited, the Arab foothold in Sindh provided contacts by which Indian learning was transmitted to the Muslim heartlands in the Middle East. As a result, Islamic civilization was enriched by the skills and discoveries of yet another civilization. Of particular importance was Indian scientific learning, which rivaled that of the Greeks as the most advanced of the ancient world. Hindu mathematicians and astronomers traveled to Baghdad after the Abbasids came to power in the mid-8th century. Their works on algebra and geometry were translated into Arabic, and their instruments for celestial observation were copied and improved by Arab astronomers. Most critically, Arab thinkers in all fields began to use the numerals that the Hindu scholars had devised centuries earlier. Because these numbers were passed on to the Europeans through contacts with the Arabs in the early Middle Ages, we call them Arabic numerals today. But they originated in India. Because of the linkages between civilized centers established by the spread of Islam, this system of numerical notation has proved central to two scientific revolutions. The first in the Middle East was discussed earlier in this chapter. The second, discussed in chapter 17, occurred in Europe some centuries later. From the 16th century to the present, it has brought fundamental transformations to Europe and much of the rest of the world. In addition to science and mathematics, Indian treatises on subjects ranging from medicine to music were translated and studied by well-endowed hospitals that the Christian Crusaders found a source of, were able to cure Arab rulers and officials whom Greek physicians had pronounced beyond help. Indian works on statecraft, alchemy, and palmistry were translated into Arabic, and it is believed that some of the tales in the Arabian Nights were based on ancient Indian stories. Indian musical instruments and melodies made their way into repertories of Arab performers, and the Indian game of chess became a favorite of both royalty and ordinary townspeople. Arabs who emigrated to Sindh and other Muslim-ruled areas often adopted Indian dress and hairstyles, ate Indian foods, and rode on elephants as the Hindus, Rajas, kings did. As figure 7.6 illustrates, the conquerors also adopted Indian building styles and artistic motifs. In this era, additional Arab colonies were established in other coastal areas, such as Malabar to the south and Bengal in the east, map 7.3. These trading enclaves later provided the staging areas from which Islam was transmitted to island and mainland Southeast Asia. From booty to empire, the second wave of Muslim invasions. After the initial conquest by Muhammad ibn Qasim's armies, little territory was added to the Muslim foothold on the subcontinent. In fact, disputes between the Arabs occupying Sindh and their world quarrels with first the Umayyad and later the Abbasid caliphs gradually weakened the Muslim hold on the era. This was reflected in the conquest of parts of the lower Indus Valley by Hindu rulers. But the gradual Muslim retreat was dramatically reversed by a new series of military invasions, this time launched by a Turkish slave dynasty that in 962 had seized power in Afghanistan to the north of the Indus Valley. The third ruler of this dynasty, Mahmud of Ghazni, led a series of expeditions that became nearly 2 centuries of Muslim raiding and conquest in northern India. Drawn by the legendary wealth of subcontinent and a zeal to spread the Muslim faith, Mahmud repeatedly raided northwest India in the first decades of the 11th century. He defeated one confederation of Hindu princes after another, and drove deeper and deeper into the subcontinent in the quest of even richer temples to loot. The raids mounted by Mahmud of Ghazni and his successors gave way in the last decades of the 12th century to sustained campaigns aimed at seizing political control in North India. The key figure in this translation was a tenacious military commander of Persian extraction, Muhammad of Ghur. After barely surviving several severe defeats at the hands of Hindu rulers, Muhammad put together a string of military victories that brought the Indus Valley and much of north-central India under his control. In the following years, Muhammad's conquests were extended along the Gangetic Plain as far as Bengal, and into west and central India, by several of his most gifted subordinated commanders. After Muhammad was assassinated in 1206, Kuthud-dinabak, one of his slave lieutenants, seized power. Significantly, the capital of the new Muslim empire was at Delhi along the Jumna River on the Gangetic Plain. Delhi's location in the very center of northern India graphically proclaimed that Muslim dynasty rooted in the subcontinent itself was not an extension of Middle Eastern Central Asian empire, but had been founded. For the next 300 years, a succession of dynasties ruled much of north and central India, alternately of Persia, Afghan, Turkic, and mixed descent. The rulers of these imperial houses proclaimed themselves the Sultans of Delhi, literally princes of the heartland. They fought each other, Mongol and Turkic invaders, and the indigenous Hindu princes for control of the Indus and Gangetic heartlands of Indian civilization. Patterns of conversion. Although the Muslims fought their way into India, their interaction with indigenous peoples soon came to be dominated by accommodation and peaceful exchanges. Over the centuries, when much of North was ruled by dynasties centered at Delhi, sizable Muslim communities developed in different areas of the subcontinent. The largest were in Bengal to the east and in northwestern areas of the Indus Valley, which were the points of entry for most of the Muslim peoples who migrated into India. Few of these converts were won forcibly. The main carriers of the new faith were often merchants, who played a growing role in both coastal and inland trade, but were most especially Sufi mystics. The latter shared much with Indian gurus and wandering ascetics in both style and message. Belief in their magical and healing powers enhanced the Sufist stature and increased their following. Their mosques and schools often became centers of regional political power. Sufis organized their devotees in militias to fend off bandits or rival princes, oversaw the clearing of forests for farming and settlement, and welcomed low-caste and outcast Hindu groups into Islam. After their deaths, the tomb of Sufi mystics became objects of veneration for Indian Muslims as well as Hindu and Buddhist pilgrims. Most of the indigenous converts who came to form a majority of the Muslims living in India were drawn from specific regions and social groups. Surprisingly, small numbers of converts were importance of forced conversions. Most Indians who converted to Islam were from Buddhist or low-caste groups. In areas such as western India and Bengal, where Buddhism had survived as popular religion until the era of the Muslim invasions, esoteric rituals and corruption practices had debased Buddhist teachings and undermined the morale of the monastic orders. This decline was accelerated by Muslim raids on Buddhist temples and monasteries, which provided vulnerable and lucrative targets for early invaders. Without monastic supervision, local congregations sank further into orgies and experiments with magic. All of these trends opposed the Buddha's social concerns and religious message. Disorganized and misdirected, Indian Buddhism was no match for confident and vigorous new religion the Muslim invaders carried into the subcontinent. This was particularly true when those who were spreading the new faith had the charisma and organizing skills of the Sufi mystics. Buddhists probably made up the majority of Indians who converted to Islam, but untouchables and low-caste Hindus, as well as tribal peoples, were animists worshipping spirits found in the natural world, were also attracted to the more egalitarian social arrangements promoted by the new faith. As the case in earlier centuries with the Buddhists, group conversions were essential because those who remained in the Hindu caste system would have little to do with those who converted. Some conversions resulted from the desire of Hindus or Buddhists to escape the head tax. The Muslim rulers levied on unbelievers. It was also promoted by intermarriage between local peoples and Muslim migrants. In addition, Muslim migrants swelled the size of the Islamic community in the subcontinent. This was particularly true in periods of crisis in Central Asia. By the 13th and 14th centuries, for example, Turkic, Persian, and Afghan peoples retreated to the comparative safety of India in the face of the Mongol and Timurid conquests that are examined in detail in Chapter 14. Patterns of accommodation. Although Islam won many converts in certain areas and communities, it has initially made more impression on the Hindu population as a whole. Despite military reverses and the imposition of Muslim political rule over large areas of the subcontinent, high-caste Hindus in particular saw invaders as the bearers of an upstart religion and as polluting outcasts. Al-Biruni, one of the chief chroniclers of the Muslim conquest, complained openly about the prevailing Indian disdain for the newcomers. The Hindus believe there is no country but theirs, no nation like theirs, no kings like theirs, no religion like theirs, no sciences like theirs. They are haughty, foolishly vain, self-conceited, and stolid. Many Hindus were willing to take positions as administrators in the bureaucracies of Muslim overlords or as soldiers in their armies and to trade with Muslim merchants. But they remained socially aloof from their conquerors. Separate living quarters were established everywhere Muslim communities developed. Genuine friendships between members of high caste groups and Muslims were rare, and sexual liaisons between them were severely restricted. During early centuries of the Muslim influx, the Hindus were convinced that, like so many of the peoples who entered the subcontinent in the preceding millennia, the Muslims would be absorbed by their superior religions and more sophisticated cultures of India. Many signs pointed to that outcome. Hindus staffed the bureaucracies and made up a good portion of the armies of Muslim rulers. In addition, Muslim princes adopted regal styles and practices that were Hindu-inspired, in contrary to the Quran. Some Muslim rulers proclaimed themselves to be of divine descent, and others minted coins decorated with Hindu images such as Nandi, the bull associated with a major Hindu god Shiva. More broadly, Muslim communities became socially divided among caste lines. Recently arrived Muslims generally were on top of the hierarchies that developed, and even they were divided depending on whether they were Arab, Turk, or Persian. High caste Hindu converts were next, followed by the social hierarchy. This may help to explain why conversions in these groups were not numerous as one would expect given the original egalitarian trust of Islam. Muslims were adopted Indian foods, Muslims also adopted Indian foods and styles of dress and took to chewing pan, or limestone wrapped with betel leaves. The Muslim influx had unfortunate consequences for women in both Muslim and Hindu communities. The invaders increasingly adopted the practice of marrying women at the earlier ages, favored by the Hindus, and the prohibitions against the remarriage of widows found especially at the high caste level of Indian society. Some high caste Muslim groups even performed the ritual of the sati, the burning of widows at some funeral pyres as their deceased husbands, which was found among some high caste Hindu groups. Islamic challenge and Hindu revival. Despite a significant degree of acculturation to Hindu lifestyle and social organization, Muslim migrants to the subcontinent held their own distinctive religious beliefs and rituals. The Hindus found Islam impossible to absorb and soon realized that they were confronted by actively proselytizing religion with great appeal to large segments of the Indian population. Partly in response to this challenge, the Hindus placed greater emphasis on the devotional cults of gods and goddesses that earlier had proved so effective in neutralizing the challenge of Buddhism. Membership in this Bhakti cults were open to all, including women and untouchables. In fact, some of the most celebrated writers of religious poetry and songs of worship were women, such as Mir Ube. Saints from low caste origins were revered by warriors and Brahmins as well by farmers, merchants, and outcasts. One of the most remarkable of these mystics was a Muslim weaver named Kabir. In plain and direct verse, Kabir played down the significance of religious differences and proclaimed that all faiths could provide a path to spiritual fulfillment. He asked, "O servant, where do thou seek me? Lo, I am beside thee. I am neither in a temple nor in mosque. Neither am I in rites and ceremonies, nor in yoga and renunciation. Because many songs and poems, such as those by Mira Ubai and Kabir, were composed in regional languages such as Bengali, Marathi, and Tamil, they were not accessible to the common people and became prominent expressions of popular culture in many areas. Bhakti mystics and gurus stressed the importance of strong emotional bond between the devotee and the god or goddess who was the subject of veneration. Chants, dances, and in some instances drugs were used to reach the state of spiritual intoxication that was the key to individual salvation. Once one had achieved the state of ecstasy that had came through intense emotional attachment to a god or goddess, all past sins were removed, and caste distinctions were rendered meaningless. The most widely worshipped deities were the gods, Shiva and Vishnu. The latter particularly in the guise of Krishna, the goat herder, depicted in the folk painting in figure 7.7. The goddess Kali was also venerated in a number of different manifestations. By increasing popular involvement in Hindu worship, and by enriching and extending the modes of prayer and ritual, the Bhakti movement may have done much to stem the flow of converts to Islam, particularly among low-caste groups. Standoff. The Muslim presence in India at the end of the Sultanate period. The attempts of mystics such as Kabir to minimize the differences between Hindu and Islamic beliefs and worship won over only small numbers of the followers of either faith. They were also strongly repudiated by the guardians of orthodoxy in each religious community. Sensing the long-term threat to Hinduism posed by Muslim political dominance and conversion efforts, the Brahmins denounced the Muslims as infidel destroyers of Hindu temples and polluted meat-eaters. Later, Hindu mystics such as the 15th century holy man Caitanya composed songs that focused on love for Hindu deities and set out to convince Indian Muslims to renounce Islam in favor of Hinduism. For their part, Muslim ulama, or religious experts, grew increasingly aware of the dangers Hinduism posed for Islam. Attempts to fuse the two faiths were rejected on the grounds that although Hindus might argue that special rituals and beliefs were not essential, they were fundamental for Islam. If one played down the teachings of the Quran prayer and the pilgrimage, was one no longer a true Muslim. Thus, contrary to the teachings of Kabir and like-minded mystics, the Ummah and even some Sufi saints stressed the teachings of Islam that separated it from Hinduism. They worked to promote unity within the Indian Muslim community and to strengthen its contacts with Muslims in neighboring lands and the Middle Eastern centers of the faith. After centuries of invasion and migration, a large Muslim community had established in the Indian subcontinent. Converts had been won, political control had been established throughout much of the area, and strong links had been forged with Muslims in other lands such as Persia and Afghanistan. But non-Muslims, particularly Hindus, remained the overwhelming majority of the population of the vast and diverse lands south of the Himalayas. Unlike the Zoroastrians in Persia or the animistic peoples of North Africa and the Sudan, most Indians showed little inclination to convert to the religion of the Muslim conquerors.